Hello, and thank you for joining us for the 17th Annual Roosevelt Reading Festival and the most recent installment of the FDR Presidential Library's At Home with the Roosevelts. I'm Paul Sparrow. I'm the director here at the FDR Library, and I'm so excited that we're able to do this. And we're hoping that next year we'll be back to doing it as a live event at the library as we get back into our normal operation, hopefully later this summer. This is our first program of the festival this year, and it starts off with one of my favorite authors, Eric Rauchway, who has done some remarkable works. His last book, Winter War, is by far the best book ever written about the transition from Hoover to Roosevelt and the foundations on which many of the New Deal programs were funded. Eric Rauchway is the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. And his new book is called Why the New Deal Matters. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the news lately, you probably are aware of the fact that a lot of people are talking about the New Deal, and some of the issues that were addressed in the 1930s and 40s are still very relevant and very political active today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Rauchway.
Thanks very much for that, Paul, and thanks to everyone for turning up, and thanks to the event staff of the FDR Library and Museum. It's a pleasure and an honor to appear on the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library stage, even virtually, for the Roosevelt Reading Festival, and to talk to you about why the New Deal matters, which, as Paul graciously noted, is the title of my new book. So for the next little bit, I'm going to talk to you about the two main reasons I think the New Deal matters to us today, and when I've finished, then I'll be happy to take questions. I think Paul will sort of manage that process. So I'm going to make the case to you briefly here that the New Deal matters for two reasons. First, it's everywhere. It's everywhere around us today. Talk a little bit about it in a second. But second reason, it remains testimony to the potential vitality of American democracy. And so it's a historical resource on which we can still draw if we choose. So, as I say, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the way in which the New Deal is everywhere. Now, if you want to see the New Deal, you don't really need to know where to look. You just need to know what it is you're looking at. Of course, I bet that many of you, especially those of you who are the audience for this reading festival, know already that you could find the legacy of the New Deal somewhere near you. For example, if we were actually in Hyde Park, New York right now, I could tell you that within walking distance of where we were standing, the village post office, which you can see the murals of here, is a New Deal building. It was dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt himself, and its murals by Orlando Dow are still there. Those are New Deal murals. So if we were there, we could say that within 20 minutes walk, we could see the legacy of the New Deal, as indeed it probably stands near you, wherever you are. It certainly is near me. About 20 minutes walk from where I'm standing, you can find Shields Library, the main library at the University of California, Davis, which was a public works administration project. And so that's the legacy of the New Deal. In fact, almost anywhere you are in the United States today, you're probably near a post office or a library or a park or a museum or a bridge, either built or improved by one or another of the New Deal agencies. Many of us know, I think, that our public spaces were and still are shaped by the New Deal. You can hardly go to a state or national park, for example, without seeing something built or improved by the Civilian Conservation Corps. For example, the telephone wire that crosses the Grand Canyon has a commemorative plaque, this one here, marking that it was put there by the CCC. The New Deal's legacy is all around us in much more modest ways as well. Also, within a short walk from where I'm standing now, you can find, as you can find in many American cities throughout the country, and indeed the territories, sidewalks that were built by the Works Progress Administration with stamps and years showing about their construction. So the New Deal's legacy is all around us in ways that are both grand and quite modest, and indeed extremely useful. But although that's the New Deal, whose legacy probably comes first to our minds, the New Deal of public buildings, public art, public parks, that sense of the New Deal as something we could visit, even if it's something inspiring that we could visit, even that understates the importance and durability and, in fact, ubiquity of the New Deal. When I said at the start that the New Deal is everywhere, I really meant everywhere, especially if you think about economic activity in the United States. If you have an account with a bank in the United States, you've made use of the New Deal. Your deposits are insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, operating since the very beginning of the New Deal, 1933. If you've used the money in your bank account to buy stocks, you've also made use of the New Deal, which established, of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission to enforce transparency laws and to regulate the securities industry in 1934. If you've bought a house, you've made use, at least indirectly, of the New Deal, whose Federal National Mortgage Association, better known as Fannie Mae, was created to ensure a national mortgage market in 1938. But you don't have to be carrying on high finance to feel the economic impact of the New Deal in our lives today. If you've joined a union, you've made use of the New Deal thanks to the Wagner Act of 1935, which protected the right to organize and bargain collectively. If you've earned minimum wage, you've made use of the New Deal thanks to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which also barred child labor. If you or anyone in your family has drawn a federal old age pension or unemployment insurance, you've made use of the New Deal thanks to the Social Security Act of 1935, which provided for those forms of social insurance and also the basis for federal disability benefits. But even that underestimates the economic ubiquity of the New Deal today. If you've ever earned, spent, borrowed, or even just handled a bill of the currency of the United States, you've made use of the New Deal. The dollar we use today is a creation of the Roosevelt administration's very first days in office, when the president took the dollar off the gold standard and secured from Congress the authority to change the value of the dollar so as to ensure the smooth functioning of the economy, and in 1933 to provide a jolt via inflationary expectations that successfully got the United States economy moving again. And even that's just getting started. Right? Talking about economic activity, the New Deal shaped how we live on the land in this country. Maybe you know that agricultural policies that we still have began during the New Deal, but the changes it brought in the American landscape go much beyond that. Many New Deal agencies, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, built dams to make the nation's rivers more manageable and also to generate power for the rural regions of the country. Those goals went along with much more ambitious plans that diversified the kinds of industry that could take place in river valleys, where agriculture was made more practical by the use of fertilizer and by plowing techniques that preserved the land from erosion. The New Deal introduced the idea of ecological thinking to large-scale policy, and its scope respected the natural boundaries of, in the case of the Tennessee, a river and its watershed. When we think today about the possibility of a Green New Deal, we should remember that the original New Deal was already, in its way and for its day, green. The New Deal also brought an end to the 19th century policies that gave federal public lands away. The homesteading policies of the 19th century were ended by the New Deal. So were the allotment policies that broke up native lands and gave them away to individual owners. Instead, New Deal laws placed the range into the trust of the Grazing Division of the Department of the Interior to promote the sustainable use of the American prairies. It also restored control of native lands to native nations, which renewed recognition of their sovereignty from the United States government with new charters that were mandated under the so-called Indian New Deal. The Department of the Interior also undertook public works campaigns specifically devoted to improvements in Indian country and employment of Indians through the Indian Emergency Conservation Work Agency, which undertook road building programs and programs to control erosion and again to improve the sustainability of the landscape for agriculture and for pasturage. Even further, in its impact on the use of the American land, the New Deal knitted all of these disparate parts of the nation together. The road building programs of the New Deal, which were by far the largest part of the Works Progress Administration, whether considered in terms of money spent or of workers employed, made the remoter parts of the nation accessible for the first time for travel and for commerce. WPA workers laid out, built, widened, and otherwise improved roads throughout the nation and its territories. So too did workers for the Civilian Conservation Corps and other New Deal agencies. It is no exaggeration to say that the New Deal literally tied the country together with its power lines and its roads, thus making the post-war economic boom possible. In fact, we could continue to note on and on how the sinews of the nation we live in today, what we sometimes rather bloodlessly now call our infrastructure, began as products of the New Deal. Not only land transportation and communication, but the air traffic control system we now have is a result of the New Deal. So too is the Federal Communications Commission. To the extent that this nation is physically connected in its parts, if it is not actually united, that is a product of the New Deal. In short, as I've suggested, it is understating the case to say we can't go through the day without making use of some part of the New Deal. It is more correct to say that it is nearly impossible to get outside the New Deal in the course of an ordinary day in the United States. And even if you're outside the United States, the New Deal shapes the way the world works. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and indeed the United Nations itself, are institutions that carried New Deal programs and ideals through the war years and into the post-war world. We live in the world the New Deal made, for ill as well as for good, although I think mostly the latter. And when we think about the impending possible end of the world, it is that world that was shaped by the New Deal that we're worrying about. So, as I say, that's the first point that I want to make to you. When we think about why the New Deal matters, we need to remember that the New Deal gives shape to our world and we reckon with it every day as we go through our ordinary lives. That's the first thing. But I started by saying that there are two main reasons that the New Deal matters, and its ubiquity, the fact that it's everywhere, was only the first. So here is the second one, and I think the more important. And that's that the New Deal entailed, amounted to, a statement of democratic purpose for the United States. Indeed, it was the largest and the most successful, if not in fact the only, statement of national purpose for this country that involved construction rather than destruction. When we think about rallying the nation for a purpose, it's usually for war. But the New Deal was an avowedly peacetime project to rally the nation, to promote and to preserve American democracy. To illustrate that point, let's go back to the New Deal, to the Democratic Convention of 1936, which happens to be in Philadelphia. At this point, Roosevelt's running for a second term. The country had already seen the New Deal in action. Voters had a chance to experience economic recovery under the Roosevelt administration. Here is how Roosevelt pitched his bid for a second term to the nation at Philadelphia in 1936. So here's some sight and sound from that Democratic Convention.
Philadelphia is a good city in which to write American history. This is fitting ground on which to reaffirm the faith of the fathers, to pledge ourselves to restore to the people a wider freedom, to give to 1936 as the founders gave to 1776, an American way of life. An old English judge said once upon a time, necessitous men are not free men. Liberty requires opportunity to make a living decent according to the standard of the time, a living which gives man not only enough to live by, but something to live for.
So you hear there Roosevelt asking his listeners at his own party's convention in Philadelphia to think about the New Deal as offering an opportunity for a new founding moment for American democracy, that 1936 should be seen as vital as 1776 in the history of the American democracy because of that principle that Roosevelt says he borrowed from an English jurist, that necessitous men are not free men, that you must have your basic needs met. Indeed, he says you must go beyond that. You must have a democracy that doesn't just give you enough to live on, it must give you enough something to live for. Roosevelt saying that with the New Deal, democracy can become a positive ideal and a positive purpose for the American people, something that allows Americans to rededicate themselves to the revolution and to press it forward with a more democratic, with small d, point of view. And here is an excerpt I'll show you from slightly later in that speech, in which Roosevelt spoke about why it was so pressing to renew a commitment to democracy at that point in world history. As he often did, of course, he invoked the King James Bible, talking about the need for faith, hope, and charity. But when he says faith here, what he says, faith, it's in the soundness of democracy in the midst of dictatorships. We need to remember how Roosevelt, the New Dealers, and indeed most Americans understood the world that they lived in during the Depression. The Great Depression was not merely a threat to the economy or to capitalism, but to democracy around the world, in a world of dictatorships, and within the United States. We need to remember for ourselves that this was, for Roosevelt, the most pressing concern during the years of the New Deal, to protect and preserve and promote democracy at a time when people were losing their faith in it, even within the United States. Now, it's not unconnected, of course, from the crisis in the economy. I mean, during the worst of the Depression, from 1929 to 1933, for about 4 years, the economy just got worse and worse and worse. Prices fell, farmers could not profitably harvest their crops, Americans went hungry in cities, unemployment there skyrocketed to something approaching 25%, and even more than half of those who still had jobs were underemployed, working only part-time. That's the economic crisis. But the democratic crisis was that in the midst, in the face of that severe hardship, it seemed as though the elected government could do nothing, or at least that it would do nothing. As far as President Herbert Hoover was concerned, the federal government was devoted to the proposition that it should do nothing, or at least as little as possible, on behalf of unemployed Americans, unless, of course, Americans should protest this inaction, in which case the government proved that it could rouse itself quite swiftly to send out the army to tear gas protesters and run them off. It's because of this severe economic depression and the evident incapacity of elected governments in the face of it within the United States as well as in the rest of the world that people began to wonder if democracy had reached the end of its history. And Roosevelt was, more than most people, sensible of this threat to democracy. When he was elected for the first time in 1932, a friend told him that if he succeeded, he would be remembered as one of the greatest presidents, and if he failed, he would be remembered as one of the worst. Roosevelt responded, "If I fail, I may well be the last." Between the election in November of 1932 and Roosevelt's first inauguration in March of 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, defying the confident prediction of observers that the conservative leadership in Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, would never permit such a thing to happen. And Hitler's regime began almost immediately to imprison enemies of the state, including communists and socialists and Jewish people, in concentration camps, defying the prediction of sensible observers that Hitler would not govern so radically as he had campaigned. But Roosevelt was one of the few people who was thoroughly alarmed by Adolf Hitler and Nazism from the first. This is the flyleaf of Franklin Roosevelt's own copy of Mein Kampf, which of course is in the possession of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library and Museum in Hyde Park, or rather, this is Roosevelt's copy of the English translation of Mein Kampf, which was published in October of 1933. Roosevelt sometimes did write notes like this to himself in his books. This is one of probably the two most famous such notes. The other one is a skeptical remark that he wrote in a sort of proto-Keynesian book about the merits of deficit spending. So it's not as if all of his flyleaf comments make him look prescient or full of foresight, but this one rather does. As you can see here, Roosevelt expresses an awareness of how ruthlessly Nazi officials had edited the English translation of Hitler's book, so as to take out much of the anti-Semitism, much of the promotion of violence, and to make Hitler's nationalism appear more mainstream and palatable to readers of English. How did Roosevelt know this? Well, he did read German, and he had friends and acquaintances who spent time in Germany, and he had a clear sense of what Hitler was saying. Hitler had not kept his plans secret. By 1932, Hitler had begun to cast Nazism as a way for Germany to achieve the strength comparable to that of the United States. As the would-be chancellor wrote, "If you want to mobilize Europe against the danger of American power, you will do it only under the leadership of a state which acts consciously according to racial laws." Hitler warned that all of Europe is moving toward a hard fate if American expansionist economic activity is not stopped somewhere and sometime. For his part, because of utterances and writings like this, Roosevelt understood Nazism as an existential threat to the United States. As Roosevelt told his aide Rexford Tugwell just after Hitler came to power in January of 1933, the accession of Hitler is a portent of evil for the United States. He will in the end challenge us because Nazism cannot exist permanently in the same world with a system whose reliance on reason and justice is fundamental. At about the same time, Franklin Roosevelt told the French ambassador to the United States, Paul Claudel, that it was vital for the future of Western civilization that the United States, France, and Britain prepare to meet the Nazi threat. But Tugwell also tells us about Roosevelt at this time. He was most concerned about the Nazi threat at home, here in America. Not only had the new Nazi government already established propaganda operations within the United States, which would continue to spread anti-Roosevelt and anti-New Deal messages through the 1930s and into the start of the 1940s, but there were homegrown movements that troubled Roosevelt because of their potential for leading to an authoritarian or fascist takeover of American government. Remember, during his first campaign for president in 1932, some thousands, possibly as many as 20,000 unemployed veterans of the Great War had come to Washington, D.C. They came at first to petition Congress for an early payment of the lump sum that they were due for their service in the Great War, a sum that was referred to as the bonus, which is why the group was called the Bonus Army, or the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus March. The House of Representatives passed a bonus bill in 1932. President Hoover said he would veto it, but he didn't have to. The Senate declined to pass the bill, but then the Bonus Army remained in Washington. They camped. They had an elaborate tent city, or a series actually, of elaborate tent encampments, protesting, marching, remaining. They had their own newspaper. Their leader was a man called Walter Waters, and Waters styled himself as a potential American strongman. He was only one of many Americans who saw in the thousands of unhappy veterans the seed of a potential movement. They had sacrificed to make the world safe for a democracy that they believed had now abandoned them. Waters suggested that a veterans movement in the United States could become something called the khaki shirts, modeled on the black shirts of Mussolini or the brown shirts of Hitler. Who knew where such a movement could lead? Now, President Hoover called out the United States Army under Douglas MacArthur's leadership to drive off the Bonus Army with tear gas and tanks and cavalry, because he was afraid that they represented a left-wing threat, a communist threat. But when Roosevelt looked at that episode, he worried that meeting disaffected Americans with force would only increase their conviction that the government then existing under the Constitution did not work for them. Remember, when he accepted the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, he said, "Reaction is no barrier to a radical. It is a challenge. It is a provocation. The way to meet that danger is to offer a workable program of reconstruction." And that, to Roosevelt and his fellow New Dealers, was the New Deal's primary purpose: to offer that workable reconstruction, a reconstruction of democracy. As Roosevelt said in 1932, the massive public works he proposed, the ones that would lead to those dams and roads and electrical lines and bridges and schools and libraries and museums, they were not merely meant to give unemployed Americans a job. They were a way to, as Roosevelt said, restore the close relationship with its people, which is necessary to preserve our democratic form of government. With all of those buildings, with all of that work, with all of that public space that was devoted to all of us, Roosevelt wanted to revive in Americans a sense that our government belongs to us, that its works belong to us, and that democracy still works for us. I've already mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps, which preserved and improved public lands, and which was, and remains indeed in memory, broadly popular. But it's worth noting that the CCC was open specifically to a group of Americans who desperately needed, as Roosevelt said in that Philadelphia speech, not just something to live on, but something to live for. The CCC employed jobless young men who, if they remained disaffected, could become the kernel of a violent threat, as they sort of generally do historically, both then and now. And the CCC was open not only to young men generally, Roosevelt also extended the CCC to include veterans of the Great War, precisely because of the threat that he saw in the Bonus Army. And that's why, in the early months of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, when some of the veterans of the Bonus March proposed a return to Washington to continue their protests, their previous leader, Walter Waters, turned them down. "There's no need for it now," he said. "We now have a government that is recognizing and attempting to improve the unemployment situation." In other words, they may not have got their bonus, but they did get jobs offers, and the New Deal thus defused the threat of an authoritarian movement according to one would-be authoritarian, right? Already in 1933, the New Deal was doing what Franklin Roosevelt said it had to do to direct Americans' discontent into a constructive and democratic direction. And it continued to do that right through Roosevelt's presidency, strengthening Americans' sense of who they were as a self-governing people and who they could become as a people who could stand against the threat of Hitler and other dictatorships throughout the world. And of course, it's worth noting that the New Deal worked. Right? The economy improved. Americans' faith in America improved. The New Deal's devotion to what Franklin Roosevelt called a broadening conception of social justice won over more voters, so that he won by a much larger margin in 1936 once people had seen what the New Deal could do, including Roosevelt was able to win over voters who historically had no interest in or faith in the Democratic Party's willingness to live up to democratic ideals, most notably black voters who shifted to Roosevelt en masse between 1932 and 1936. Now, the New Deal was imperfect. Its legacy was and remains imperfect, perhaps especially for those who most desperately wanted to believe in it, as like those black voters whom I've just mentioned. But it still matters because it held out and it at least began to deliver on a promise. It demonstrated the possibility of realizing an improved democracy for all Americans. And that's why Americans, even those Americans who are most mindful of the New Deal's historic shortcomings, still invoke it today as a way for us to inspire each other to improve American democracy. Okay, those are my two reasons the New Deal matters. It's everywhere, and it gives us a sense of what our democracy can be. And so I see that Cliff has helpfully put up the ticker saying that you should ask questions if you have them, and I gather that Paul will moderate the question period. So thanks for listening to my presentation.
And great presentation, Eric. Thank you very much. Before we get to the audience questions, I have one question for you, which is a big one. After Hoover was defeated in 1932, he essentially spent the rest of his life trying to convince people that he was right and Roosevelt was wrong, and that in fact the New Deal policies extended the Great Depression and worsened the economic situation. And his commitment to this narrative has spawned a whole generation of people who continuously, you and I both encounter them online all the time, say that the New Deal was a failure, it extended the Depression, didn't do anybody any good. How do you rebut that?
Well, I would point to the basic data on economic recovery in the 1930s. If you look at the official business cycle dating committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research, who are not partisans, right? These are people who just date the business cycles. That's what they do. The economy turns around in March of 1933, the moment Franklin Roosevelt takes office. And there are generally two reasons that people point to for that. Number one is Roosevelt acted where Hoover would not. That is to say, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday and audited and saved the banking system of the United States. Roosevelt also took the dollar off the gold standard, and after 4 years of deflation, promoted the idea that prices would go up. And if prices are going to go up, that means if you have money, those people who still have money now have an incentive to spend it, because their money will be worth a little less tomorrow and the day after that if there's going to be inflation. So by saving the banks and by promoting inflation, Roosevelt spurred a recovery that then continued very strong through his time in office. During the first 4 years of Roosevelt's presidency, you saw 8, 9, 10% annual growth of the United States economy, of the gross domestic product, even if it's adjusted for inflation. That very rapid growth even for an economy coming out of a recession, that's rapid, that's unprecedentedly rapid growth for a peacetime period. So even if Hoover was right, just to say what you said there, even if Hoover was right that the New Deal was a drag on the economy, it was not a sufficient drag to prevent a record period of economic growth. So that means that all of the benefits you got with the New Deal, like people actually having jobs instead of starving to death, banks actually remaining open instead of failing, right? Farmers being able to sell their crops for something that they could live on, plus roads, bridges, schools, art. You got all of those things without preventing a record strong economic recovery. So even if Hoover was right, who cares? You got all of that stuff together with a very strong recovery. And of course, I don't think he was right. And it's not mainstream economic opinion for people to think that Hoover was right either.
We have a question on this point from Sean Lee. Is the ongoing attack on a New Deal from the right since the 1970s a significant contributor in the loss of faith in our elections?
Well, that's a big question too. Yeah, thank you. I think that maybe not directly, but certainly indirectly. I mean, I think the Gallup poll asks a question, at least annually, maybe more often, and it has been for many decades. And it's something to do like whether you trust the government to do the right thing. And so we just generally refer to that as the trust in government question, right? And it's been declining right about since, the sort of Lyndon Johnson, Nixon administration. And most of that decline has had to do with, the revelation that our government has been up to no good, like the Pentagon Papers or Watergate. And then you had something of a recovery in the early Reagan years, and then with the revelation of Iran-Contra, it tanks again, and you had a little bit of a tick upwards during Clinton, and then it goes south again, during the George W. Bush years, and so forth and so on. So it remains very high through the period when the New Deal was the framework for American government, right through the 60s. And then it begins to fall as Americans move away from the New Deal in the early 70s. Now, is that a result of the right-wing attack on it, as you suggest? Partly, certainly, but they're also sort of, jumping on a kind of situation where the government has weakened itself because of its policies. But it's certainly true that since that period, down to, just a few months ago, right, there was sort of a reflexive tendency to kind of edge away from the New Deal, even among most Democrats, or certainly among the Democratic leadership. Now that has just suddenly and dramatically changed quite recently, quite possibly because with the the vaccine rollout, we saw, our government can do good things for us, even in a great crisis. So maybe people are more inclined now to believe that, at least for the moment.
We have a great question here from Merrill Morris. Do you see any trends in American culture that give you hope for a return to a more compassionate and inclusive politics as FDR had?
Well, as I say, the fact that the New Deal and Roosevelt have come back into the mainstream of political discourse. The current president invoked Roosevelt just a few months ago with his joint address to the Joint Houses of Congress, where he made the point, as I have for you today, that Roosevelt was really focused on preserving democracy. The idea that we are going to rededicate ourselves to that legacy seems to us to be a very hopeful sign. And the ability of Americans to rally around that idea, of course, remains to be seen. The ability of the majority party in Congress to enact an agenda that would support that idea also remains to be seen. But the general thrust of discussion coming out of the top reaches of the administration and of Congress, at least at the moment, are somewhat hopeful, it seems to me.
We have a question from one of our most loyal fans, Marcy Pallenberg. She asks, how did opposition to FDR's rebuilding plan echo the current opposition's attitude towards the Green New Deal and the Biden infrastructure plan?
Well, in discussions within the administration, the Roosevelt administration, that is, very early on, there were a number of people who thought, well, nobody could possibly dislike these kinds of programs. You know, we're bringing things to people that they want. It's like acting like Santa Claus. And Harry Hopkins, which, you know, was one of the great promoters and operators of the public works agencies, said some parts of the country, there's folks who would shoot Santa Claus if he came down their chimney. And in that sense, I think there is some echo. There is some sense that folks in the 30s placed other values, what we would today call cultural values, higher than the ability to live prosperous and, you know, sort of meaningful lives. Particularly in the American South, there were folks who were much more devoted to the institutions that maintained Jim Crow and the disfranchisement of Black Americans, such that that caused them to resist some New Deal measures that were, they thought, going to undermine Jim Crow and disfranchisement of Black Americans. So much so, of course, that the Roosevelt administration ultimately, you know, took aim directly at those institutions in the South, with the establishment in Roosevelt's second term of the Civil Liberties Section, which became the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, which began bringing voting rights cases to undermine the one-party rule in the South.
Okay, I think we have one more question, and then I have a question for you. This is from Tony Sarcone. What do you see as FDR's greatest New Deal failure? Here's a challenge for you.
Well, I mean, I guess this follows naturally from what I just said. I think that the failure is, you know, not to challenge Jim Crow more directly and more consistently, right? I mean, Roosevelt was a Democrat at that time. The Democratic Party was the party of Jim Crow in the South. If you want an electoral college majority, if you wanted a congressional majority, you needed to have Southern votes. And Roosevelt therefore compromised frequently with Jim Crow politicians during that period, and that seems to me to be a moral failure, and it's one that a number of people have pointed out. The great economist Robert Weaver, who later became the first Black cabinet secretary under Lyndon Johnson, you know, worked for the Roosevelt administration from 1933 onward. And when he was asked about it later, said, you know, he thought that Roosevelt was a great president, but not, of course, a great civil rights president. And that's the distinction that I would draw as well. I think that Roosevelt was, exhibited a moral failure on that issue. Now, you could reasonably ask if maybe he, you know, wasn't making a political calculation that made sense to him and possibly was even necessary in order to get New Deal legislation passed. That's certainly what he would have said. It's not a decision that I would like to have to make myself because it seems to me to be morally objectionable. But that's what I would point to.
I am going to do one more question from the our viewers, because this is a good one. I know you have a great answer for this. Sean Lee asks, how do you respond to the statement that it was World War II and not the New Deal that ended the Great Depression?
I respond in two ways. First of all, as I've suggested in response to Paul's first question, the economy was recovering throughout the 1930s, with the exception of the 1937 recession. Now, something can be going in the right direction, that is to say, towards recovery, and going very rapidly, as I say, sort of at 10% growth per year, and still not get all the way there, because there is, in this case, very far away. That is to say, by the time Roosevelt took office, the economy was in such a hole, you could go very fast and very far and still not be all the way out of it. So number one, the economy was recovering under the New Deal very rapidly. And therefore, if you look at a chart, golly, Paul, I might even have a chart.
There we go.
If you look at a chart right here, you can sort of see recovery coming along from the time Roosevelt takes office, there's the recession, and then again afterwards up here, you could sort of cut off the war, and you could see that you're moving in the right direction in terms of economic growth, even before you get to, the war. So that's the first point. You can see that same thing here. This is maybe even a little bit clearer. This is, sort of just real GDP growth. Here's when Roosevelt takes office. Here's sort of the New Deal. There's the 37 recession. And then this is the rest of Roosevelt's second term. So this whole thing right here is just Roosevelt's first 2 terms. So these are the New Deal years. The war isn't even on this graph. So you can see right here that you're moving in the right direction even under the New Deal. You could say that you could see you're just about back onto trend here by the end of the New Deal. Sorry to be in the way of my own graph there. I wasn't actually planning on showing this graph, but there it is. Now, that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, when you say it was the war and not the New Deal that ended the Great Depression, what you're saying is the New Deal should have been bigger sooner. That's all you're saying. I mean, there's nothing magical about tanks and airplanes that when the federal government employs people to build them, that causes an economic recovery in a way that employing people to build bridges, schools, etc. does not, right? It's just federal employment. It's just that federal employment for the war is bigger. Right? So what that means is you could have had a public works program on the scale of World War II back here and achieved a much bigger, faster recovery, wiping out a lot of the long-term unemployed, that persists through here sooner if the New Deal had only been as big or even maybe half as big as the wartime public works program. So if you say that the war ended the New Deal, the war ended the Depression, not the New Deal, all you're saying is World War II was a really big public works program, and we should have had a bigger public works program before we had to do it by building tanks and airplanes. So that's the answer to that question.
And I knew you knocked that out of the park. All right, so we're going to end appropriately enough with the last line from your book, because I think it goes to this bigger question of FDR's philosophy, his vision, why he was so committed to this. After 12 years of Republican control of the White House and Congress and very pro-business, anti-labor, laissez-faire attitude, trusts erupting, private enterprise was everything, the government should have no role. Roosevelt comes along and just completely overturns all of that and starts all these massive projects. And he wasn't doing it just for economic reasons, as you say, and I really love this. Can I get your book visible there? Here we go. You say, the New Deal effort, incompletely realized but doggedly pursued, of improving the economy by improving democracy remains an outsized ambition even today. So the work continues, right?
The work has to continue, right? It never does itself. It requires us to want to do it and actually get out there and do it.
Yeah, I think the idea that improving democracy, strengthening democracy, increasing participation, giving people opportunity, giving everyone opportunity, or most people opportunity. There's still a lot of civil rights issues in that New Deal, but really does make America work in the way it was intended. Eric, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. This was fantastic. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm hoping next year we can have you here in person. Good luck with your new book, and I hope it's a big success.
Thanks to you and to everyone there and to everyone watching. I appreciate the opportunity. It's always a pleasure.
All right, I'll be back in a little while at 6 o'clock with John Riggs on a book about high tension and FDR's efforts to bring rural electrification and the TVA. We'll see you soon.